You will walk down that aisle, Emmeline, or I swear you will regret it.
The church doors burst open, not with joy, not with flowers or laughter or the soft sounds of a wedding morning. They burst open because a girl was being pushed through them. Emmeline did not walk to that altar. She was carried there by her mother's iron grip, by whispered threats, and by the weight of a family secret, so heavy it had crushed her before she even had a chance to breathe. Her sister was gone, vanished in the night with the stable boy she loved, and now the most powerful, most feared duke in all of England was standing at the altar, waiting for a bride. And Emmeline was the only sister left. She had never met the Duke of Ashvale. She had only heard stories, that his eyes were cold enough to freeze a river, that he had buried one betrothed already, that men twice his size stepped aside when he walked into a room, that he never smiled, that he never begged, that he never lost. Her hands were shaking inside her gloves. The veil over her face was her sister's veil. The ring on this altar was meant for her sister's hand. Even the perfume on her neck had been sprayed there by her mother, because it was her sister's favorite scent. She was not a bride, she was a replacement. And then she reached the altar, and the Duke turned. His eyes did not go to the veil. They did not go to the flowers or the crowd or the bishop waiting with the holy book. His eyes went straight to her hands, those shaking, terrified hands, and something moved across his face. Not a shock, not anger, something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. He leaned close, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath through the thin lace of her veil, and in a voice only she could hear, he said, "You are not Harriet." She stopped breathing. "No," he said softly, and she heard something in his tone she could not name. "You are far more interesting than Harriet." And before she could run, before she could think, before she could do anything at all, he took her hand and turned to face the bishop. "Now tell me, if you were Emmeline at that moment, what would you do? Run or stay? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story already has your heart, please hit the subscribe button. We are just getting started.
Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Emmeline Voss had spent 24 years being the quiet one, not the beautiful one, not the charming one. Those titles had always belonged to Harriet, her older sister, the girl who could walk into a room and make every head turn without even trying. Harriet had a laugh that sounded like music. Harriet had the golden hair and the easy smile, and the way of speaking that made powerful men feel like they were the most important people alive. Emmeline had books. Emmeline had ink-stained fingers and a habit of saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. She was the sister who sat in corners at balls, the one mothers pointed at when warning their daughters about what happened to girls who read too much and danced too little. She had made peace with that. Truly she had. But nothing, not a single page of any book she had ever read, had prepared her for the morning she woke up to find Harriet's bed empty, a note on the pillow, and her mother screaming so loudly the housemaids came running from 3 floors down. Harriet was gone. The note said only this: "I am sorry. I love Thomas. Do not look for me." Thomas, the stable boy, the one their father had dismissed 6 months ago after catching him and Harriet whispering behind the rose garden wall. Their father had called it an embarrassment. Their mother had called it a phase. Harriet had said nothing, gone quiet for weeks, and apparently spent those weeks planning an escape so clean and so complete that by the time anyone found the note, she and Thomas were already hours away. Emmeline stood in the doorway of Harriet's empty room and felt two things at once: a deep, aching pride in her sister for choosing love, and a cold, creeping terror about what was going to happen next. Because today was not just any day. Today was the day Harriet was supposed to marry the Duke of Ashvale. The contract had been signed 8 months ago. The Duke's solicitors had come to their family home with papers so thick and formal they looked like a piece of government legislation. The alliance between the Calloway family and the Duke of Ashvale was not just a wedding. It was a financial rescue. Their father, Lord Gerald Calloway, had debts. Quiet debts, the kind that lived in dark corners and only came out at night. The Duke had agreed to clear every single one of them in exchange for the hand of the eldest Calloway daughter. That had been Harriet. Harriet was gone. Emmeline watched her mother pace the length of the sitting room, and she already knew, even before the words came, exactly what was about to be said. "You will go in her place." Those 5 words landed like 5 separate blows. "Mother." Emmeline's voice came out smaller than she wanted. "You cannot be serious." Lady Gerald Calloway stopped pacing. She turned, and her face was not the face of a grieving mother or a panicked woman. It was the face of someone doing calculations. Fast, cold calculations about survival. "Your father's creditors come at the end of this month," she said. "If this wedding does not happen today, we will lose everything. The house, the land, the carriages, every gown on your back. Do you understand what I am telling you? I understand that you want me to deceive a duke. I want you to save this family. They are not the same thing." Her mother crossed the room in 4 steps and took Emmeline's face in both hands. Not gently. The grip was firm, urgent, almost desperate, and that more than anything frightened Emmeline, because her mother was never desperate. Her mother was always composed. "Listen to me," she whispered. "You are 24 years old. You are not yet married. You have had no serious suitors. At your age, in this society, that already marks you. But if you walk into that church today and you become the Duchess of Ashvale, none of that will matter anymore. You will be protected. You will have a title and a household and security that no debt can touch. And when the Duke discovers I am not Harriet, he has never met Harriet. The contract only specified the eldest Calloway daughter. You are not the eldest, but he does not know that. Once the vows are spoken, what can he do?" Emmeline pulled back from her mother's hands. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "He can do a great deal," she said. "He is a duke. Then do not give him reason to. Be charming, be sweet, be the kind of woman a man is glad he married." Her mother picked up Harriet's veil from the chair where it had been laid out the night before, pressed and perfect, and waiting for a bride who was now somewhere on a country road, headed toward a different life. "Put this on." Emmeline looked at that veil for a long moment. She thought about running. She genuinely did. She thought about grabbing her coat and her small savings and walking out the back door the same way Harriet had. But where would she go? Harriet had Thomas. Emmeline had no one. And her mother was right about one brutal truth. 24 and unmarried in this world meant invisible. It meant dependent. It meant a future that narrowed a little more each year until there was almost nothing left. She reached out and took the veil. She told herself it was just for today, that she would find a way to explain once the papers were signed and the debts were cleared, that perhaps the Duke was reasonable. Perhaps he would understand. Perhaps he would even let her go quietly once the financial arrangement had been honored. She told herself many things in the carriage ride to the church. She did not believe any of them. The church was full. Of course it was full. A wedding between a duke and a lord's daughter drew every family with social ambitions within 30 miles. Emmeline could hear the murmur of the crowd through the heavy wooden doors as she stood outside with her father, her mother fussing with the veil one last time, pressing it down over Emmeline's face with hands that were now trembling. Her father said nothing. He had not spoken a single word since they left the house. He simply offered his arm, and his face was the face of a man who had made a choice he already regretted, but could not take back. Emmeline took his arm. The doors opened. The organ began, and every single person in that church turned to look at her. She walked. She kept her eyes forward and her steps even, and she walked the longest walk of her life up that aisle, with her heart shattering quietly behind her ribs. She passed faces she did not know. Ladies in elegant hats, gentlemen in pressed coats, children sitting still for once, sensing the gravity of adult ceremony. She passed flower arrangements, so extravagant, they reached toward the high stone ceiling. She passed candlelight that turned everything gold and warm and sacred. And at the end of it all, she saw him, the Duke of Ashvale. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulders, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been cut, rather than grown. He stood with his back straight and his hands clasped behind him, and there was a stillness about him that was more commanding than any loud entrance could ever be. He was not fidgeting. He was not nervous. He simply stood there as though the church, the guests, the whole elaborate occasion were things happening around him rather than for him. He turned when she reached the altar, and Emmeline felt her breath leave her completely. His eyes were grey. Not cold grey, not the frozen river grey she had been told about. They were the grey of a sky just before rain, full and heavy and waiting, and they did not look at her veil. They did not perform the usual sweep that men did, cataloguing and assessing. They went straight to her hands, her shaking, terrified, giving everything away hands. She watched his expression shift. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in the novels she loved, with gasps and declarations. It was a small shift, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness that became somehow even more still. He leaned in, close enough that she could smell him, something clean and faintly woody, like a library that had been aired out on a winter morning, close enough that when he spoke, no one else in that church could possibly have heard it. "You are not Harriet." 3 words, quiet as a whisper, heavy as a sentence. Emmeline's whole body went rigid. She said nothing. She could not say anything. Her tongue had simply stopped working. "No," he said, and the word came out slower this time, thoughtful, as though he were reaching a conclusion he found genuinely interesting. "You are far more interesting than Harriet." And then, before she could breathe or think or move, he took her hand, turned to face the bishop, and the ceremony began. She married the Duke of Ashvale with her sister's veil over her face, and her own name nowhere in the vows. And the whole time, his thumb moved slowly, almost absently, back and forth across her knuckles, as if he were trying to calm her, as if he already knew, as if this were not a surprise to him at all. The wedding breakfast was a performance Emmeline was not prepared to give. Tables had been arranged in the great hall of Ashvale House, the Duke's London residence, a building so large and so coldly magnificent that Emmeline felt like something small and fragile that had been placed inside it by mistake. Crystal caught the light from a dozen windows. Flowers that must have cost more than most families spent in a month sat in towers at the center of every table. Footmen moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing with plates and glasses, and practiced invisibility. Emmeline sat at the head table as the new Duchess of Ashvale and smiled until her face ached. Guests came to congratulate her. Ladies with sharp, curious eyes pressed her hands and said lovely things with their mouths, while asking entirely different questions with their expressions. Gentlemen bowed and murmured polite words. An elderly countess with magnificent white hair told Emmeline that she had heard Harriet Calloway was a great beauty, and paused just long enough after saying it to make the observation feel like a test. "Beauty is a matter of perspective," Emmeline said, and the Countess laughed, which was apparently the right answer, and moved on. Emmeline reached for her wine glass and drank more than she intended. The Duke sat beside her through all of it. He was courteous to the guests, attentive in the precise and measured way that told her he had done this kind of thing many times before, and found it neither difficult nor enjoyable. He answered questions. He accepted congratulations. He made exactly the right comments at exactly the right moments. But between guests, in the small silences, she could feel him watching her. Not the way the other men in the room watched her, assessing her place in the social hierarchy, or calculating whether she was worth knowing. He watched her the way someone watches a door. They are not sure they should open yet. She said nothing to him. He said nothing to her, until the last guest had moved away, and there was a brief pocket of quiet, and he picked up his own glass and said, without looking at her, "You have not eaten anything." "I am not hungry." "You have been smiling for 4 hours. That requires energy." He turned his head then and looked at her directly. "Eat something." It was not a request, but it was not unkind either. It landed somewhere in between, in a place she did not have a name for. She picked up her fork. A small victory crossed his face, so brief she almost missed it. The guests thinned eventually, then disappeared altogether, and then there was the terrible quiet of a house that had just emptied itself of other people, leaving only the two of them inside its vast, echoing rooms. Emmeline stood in the entrance hall while the last carriage pulled away and tried to think clearly about what her situation actually was. She was married. Legally, formally, completely married. The papers had been signed and witnessed. The vows had been spoken. Whatever happened next, she could not simply walk back out the front door and pretend the mourning had not occurred. She heard his footsteps behind her, unhurried, deliberate. "Come," he said. "There is something we need to discuss." He led her to a study off the main corridor. It was a room that suited him, she thought. Dark wood, books along every wall from floor to ceiling, a fire burning low in the grate, a desk that had the look of something actually used rather than merely displayed. He did not sit behind the desk. He stood beside the fireplace, one arm resting along the mantel, and looked at her with those quiet grey eyes. "Sit down, please," he said. She sat, spine straight, hands folded, the posture of a woman preparing for an execution she already knows is coming. "Your name," he said. "Your real name." A pause. There was no point in the pretense, she decided. Whatever game she might have tried to play, he had already seen through it at the altar. Trying to maintain the fiction now would only make her seem foolish on top of everything else. "Emmeline," she said. "Emmeline Calloway, Harriet's younger sister." He nodded once, as though confirming something he had already known. "How did you know?" she asked. "At the altar. You knew immediately." "How?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have met Harriet Calloway," he said. "Once." briefly at a function 6 months ago. She was charming and bright and very deliberately made sure I noticed her. You walked up that aisle trying not to be noticed at all. A pause. It was a significant difference. Emmeline felt heat rise in her face. Then why did you not stop the ceremony? He looked at her steadily. Because I chose not to. Those 4 words sat in the air between them like something solid. You chose, she repeated. Yes. You chose to marry a woman you did not know, whose name you had not been told, in place of the woman you had agreed to marry. I chose to proceed with a contract that had been made in good faith on my side, he said. What happened on yours is your family's business. What matters legally is that the papers named the eldest Calloway daughter, and your mother made a decision about which daughter that would be. I decided not to interfere with it. Emmeline stared at him. That is either very generous or very frightening. It is neither. It is practical. He moved away from the fireplace and sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees in a way that made him seem suddenly less formal, more immediate. Let me be honest with you, because I find honesty saves a great deal of time. I needed this alliance. Your father's debts were not the only reason for this marriage. There are people in this city who have been waiting for a vulnerability in my position. A duke without a wife is, apparently, an invitation for complications I do not have the patience for. The marriage itself is what I needed, not a specific woman. Emmeline absorbed this. So I am a solution to a problem. You are my wife, he said, and something in the way he said it made it sound less cold than it should have. What that means going forward is something we determine together. She looked at him for a long moment, at the serious, still face, the grey eyes that gave away less than they took in, the hands that had held hers at the altar, with a steadiness she had clung to without meaning to. What is your name? She asked. I realize I have married you, and I know only your title. Something crossed his face, something small and unguarded, and almost warm. Dorian, he said. Dorian Ashvale. Dorian. She tried the name in her mouth. I am Emmeline. I know. And then, unexpectedly, quietly, like something he had not quite planned to say. It suits you better than Harriet ever could have. She did not know what to do with that. So she said nothing, and the fire burned low between them, and somewhere in the walls of that enormous house, the silence settled into something that was not quite comfortable, but was not quite threatening either. It was something new. Something without a name yet. Later, a housemaid showed her to the rooms that had been prepared for the Duchess. They were on the east wing, separated from the Duke's rooms by a long corridor and 2 closed doors, and Emmeline stood in the centre of them and looked at everything that had clearly been arranged for Harriet. The flowers on the vanity, the particular arrangement of the room, the careful, deliberate luxury of it. She sat on the edge of the bed, and finally, for the first time since the morning, let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The fear came first, fast and sharp and real. She was in a stranger's house, married to a man she had met 3 hours ago. Her family was somewhere across the city. Safe now, their debts settled, their crisis resolved. Harriet was somewhere on a road with Thomas, building the life she had chosen. And Emmeline was here, alone, in a room full of flowers meant for someone else. Then something unexpected happened. Underneath the fear, quieter but steady as a heartbeat, was something else. Curiosity, because Dorian Ashvale was not what she had been told. He was not cold. He was not cruel. He had known. He had known at the altar, and he had chosen to take her hand anyway, and he had said her name suits you better, and he had told her I chose, and there was something in all of that which didn't match the story she had been carrying into that church. She thought about his eyes, the rain-heavy grey of them, the way they had gone straight to her hands. She pressed her own hands together in her lap and sat with that thought for a long time. Outside the window, London moved on in its usual, indifferent way. Carriages and voices, and the distant sound of something that might have been music. The city that did not know or care that a girl named Emmeline Calloway had walked into a church that morning as herself and walked out as someone entirely new. She reached up and unpinned Harriet's veil from her hair. She set it on the vanity. She looked at her own face in the mirror for a long moment and asked herself the question she had been avoiding all day. What happens now? She did not have an answer yet. But for the first time since the church doors had burst open that morning, she was not entirely sure she was afraid of finding out. The door to her room opened without a knock, and Emmeline spun around, heart slamming. It was not Dorian. It was a woman. Tall, sharp-featured, dressed with the kind of precision that said money and breeding in every seam. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the exact same grey as the Duke's. She looked at Emmeline, the way one looks at an unexpected stain on an expensive tablecloth. "So," she said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. "You are not Harriet Calloway." Emmeline rose to her feet. "No, ma'am. I'm Emmeline Calloway." "I am Countess Wykeham," the woman said, "Dorian's aunt, and I have known about this family's deception since yesterday morning." She tilted her head. "What I do not yet know is whether you were a willing participant or a victim of your own mother's desperation." Emmeline held the woman's gaze and said the only true thing there was to say. "Both." The Countess studied her for a long, unbearable moment. Then she said, "Honest. That is something, at least." And she turned and walked back out without another word, leaving Emmeline standing alone in the middle of a room that felt suddenly very, very small. The morning after the wedding, Emmeline came down to breakfast and found 3 people already seated at the long dining table who had not been there the night before. The first was a young man of perhaps 20, with Dorian's dark hair but none of his stillness. He was restless in his chair, turning a silver spoon over and over in his fingers, and he looked up when Emmeline entered with the bright, unguarded curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to hide what he felt. The second was a woman close to Emmeline's own age, pretty in a sharp way, with copper-coloured hair pinned severely and eyes that moved fast and missed nothing. The third was an older gentleman with a white beard and a waistcoat that had seen better decades, who was reading a folded newspaper and did not look up at all. Dorian was at the head of the table. He rose when she entered, which surprised her, and gestured to the chair on his right. "My brother," he said, nodding toward the young man. "Fletcher Ashvale." Fletcher dropped the spoon, stood up, and grinned. "You are much more interesting looking than I expected," he said. "Harriet Calloway has a reputation for being rather obvious. You do not look obvious at all." "Fletcher," Dorian said, with a single quiet note of warning. Fletcher sat back down but kept grinning. "My secretary, Miss Opal Crane," Dorian continued, indicating the copper-haired woman, who gave Emmeline a precise, professional nod. "And Sir Barnaby Holt, my solicitor, who is apparently incapable of conducting business anywhere other than my breakfast table." Sir Barnaby lowered his newspaper just far enough to look at Emmeline over the top of it, made a small sound that might have been a greeting, and raised it again. Emmeline sat down. A footman appeared instantly with tea and a plate she had not asked for but was grateful for because it gave her hands something to do. "There is a matter," Dorian said, "that requires your awareness before it reaches you, through less direct channels." She looked at him. "There is talk," Miss Crane said, stepping in with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering difficult information. "It began last night. Several guests at the wedding noted that the bride did not resemble the descriptions they had heard of Harriet Calloway. By this morning, at least 4 households are asking questions." Emmeline set down her teacup very carefully. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that, if left unanswered, becomes scandalous," Dorian said. "And scandal in this particular social climate is not merely embarrassing. It has legal implications for the validity of the marriage contract." The word validity landed on Emmeline like cold water. "You mean someone could argue the marriage is not legitimate?" she said. "Someone is already arguing it," Sir Barnaby said, from behind his newspaper. "Lord Fenwick. He has been looking for a foothold against Ashvale for 2 years. This is exactly the kind of irregularity he would take to a magistrate." "Who is Lord Fenwick?" Emmeline asked. Dorian's jaw tightened. "Just slightly. A man who believes he owed something that I refused to give him. The details are not important right now. What is important is that we present a unified and convincing account of this marriage before his version of events becomes the one people believe." Emmeline looked around the table. Fletcher was no longer grinning. Miss Crane had a small notebook open and a pen ready. Sir Barnaby had finally put down his newspaper and was watching her with shrewd, assessing eyes. "What account?" Emmeline said. "The truth, adjusted," Dorian said. "You are Emmeline Calloway, younger sister of Harriet. Harriet suffered a sudden illness the night before the wedding, and the family made the decision to honor the contract by sending you in her place, with the full knowledge and agreement of all parties." "Including yours," Emmeline said slowly. "Including mine. I was informed before the ceremony. I agreed. The marriage proceeded with full transparency." He said it simply, with the calm of a man who had already decided this was the version of events that would stand. "That is a lie," Emmeline said. "It is a story," he replied. "There is a difference. A lie is told to harm. This is told to protect something that is already real and already legal." She looked at him for a long moment. There was no guilt on his face, but there was also no coldness. He was looking at her the way he had at the altar, that direct, steady attention that felt like being seen rather than watched. "And my family?" she asked. "Your mother has already been spoken to this morning. She is in agreement." Of course she was. Emmeline pressed her fingers together under the table. "And Harriet?" A brief silence. "Harriet's absence will be explained as a recovery period," Miss Crane said carefully. "She will be said to be resting at a private address. By the time anyone thinks to press further, the story will be old news." Emmeline nodded slowly. She did not love it, but she understood it. And she understood with a clarity that felt almost like grief that she was no longer in a position where her preferences were the deciding factor. "All right," she said. "I will support the account." Fletcher let out a breath. "Good. Because Fenwick is unpleasant, and I would rather not spend the next year in court." "You will not be in court," Dorian said, with the certainty of a man who intended to make that true. After breakfast, Miss Crane took Emmeline through a quiet but thorough briefing of the household, the staff, the schedule, the social obligations that came with the title of duchess. It was an enormous amount of information delivered in a short time, and Miss Crane delivered it without warmth, but also without condescension, which Emmeline appreciated. Toward the end of it, walking back through the main corridor, Emmeline said, "How long have you worked for the Duke?" 4 years, Miss Crane said. "Do you trust him?" Miss Crane paused her walking for just a fraction of a second. Then she said, "He has never once given me reason not to." She said it simply, and moved on. That afternoon, Dorian found Emmeline in the library. She had discovered it by accident, pushing open a door she thought led to the garden, and finding instead a room that made her stop in the doorway and simply stare. It was 2 floors high, with a spiral iron staircase leading to a gallery above, and books on every surface, not arranged decoratively but used, leaning, marked, stacked in the particular chaos of a room that was actually lived in. She had been standing in the middle of it for 10 minutes when she heard his footsteps at the door. "You found it," he said. "I was not looking for a garden at all," she said honestly. Something in his expression shifted. "This was the room I spent most of my childhood in." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with his arms loosely crossed. And there was something different about him in this room. The formal precision he carried everywhere else had relaxed slightly, like a coat shrugged off at the shoulders. "It shows," she said, looking at the state of the shelves. "A librarian would weep." "A librarian would have nothing to do," he said. "I know where everything is." That is what people with chaotic bookshelves always say. He walked in, stood beside her. She was aware of the closeness in a way that was different from standing near a stranger. Something had shifted since the breakfast table, since the conversation in the study last night. The edges between them were not as sharp. "Are you frightened?" he asked. The directness of it startled her. "Yes," she said, because it was true, and she had already decided that lying to this man was not only pointless, but felt somehow wrong. "Of me?" She considered it genuinely. "No," she said. "Of the situation, of Fenwick, of what happens if the story does not hold." A pause. "Of your aunt." That surprised him into something close to a smile. "Aunt Wycombe came to see you last night." "She did. She called me honest, and then left without telling me what that meant." "From her, honesty is high praise," he said. "She dismissed the last 3 women I was expected to marry within minutes of meeting them." Emmeline looked at him. "How many women have you been expected to marry?" 3 before you." "What happened to them?" He was quiet for a moment. "The first died. Fever, in the winter of 1812. The second changed her mind and married a viscount in Bath, which was the right decision for everyone involved. The third." He paused. "The third is a longer story." Emmeline waited. "She was in love with someone else," he said finally. "She did not tell me. I found out 6 weeks before the wedding, and I ended the engagement myself. A beat. I would always rather know the truth, even when it is painful." The words settled into the space between them with a weight she felt in her chest. He was telling her something, not just about the third woman. He was telling her something about himself, about what he valued, and underneath it was a question he had not yet asked directly. She thought about Harriet, about the note on the pillow, about her mother's iron grip on her face that morning, about all the ways she had arrived at this marriage without a single honest choice being given to her. "I did not want to deceive you," she said quietly. "I know. I did not have very many options. I know that too." He looked at her. "I am not asking for an apology, Emmeline. I am asking for a beginning." She held his gaze for a long moment, this man who was her husband, who had known at the altar and reached for her hand anyway, who had called her interesting and meant it, who had grown up in a room full of beloved and chaotic books. "All right," she said softly. A beginning. Outside the library windows, London was grey and heavy with the promise of rain. Inside, the fire caught and held.
Our bed rest poet.
Lord Fenwick arrived at Ashvale House 4 days later, and he did not knock. Emmeline was in the upstairs sitting room with Countess Wykeham, who had installed herself in the house with the ease of someone who had always considered it partially hers, when she heard the commotion below. Raised voices, the particular sharp sound of a door being opened against a footman's resistance. Countess Wykeham did not look up from her embroidery. "That will be Fenwick," she said. "You knew he was coming." "I knew he would come eventually. I simply did not expect him to be so obvious about it." She set down her needle with deliberate calm. "Go to Dorian. Do not let Fenwick see you flustered. Whatever he says, whatever he implies, you are the Duchess of Ashvale, and you have been so since the morning of your wedding, with full knowledge and agreement of all parties. Do you understand?" "Yes," Emmeline said. "Say it like you mean it." Emmeline straightened her spine. "I understand completely." Wykeham looked at her for a moment and gave a single approving nod. Emmeline went downstairs. Lord Fenwick was in the entrance hall. He was a broad man, florid-faced, with the look of someone who had once been handsome and knew it and resented that time had moved on without his permission. He was speaking to Dorian in the low, pointed tone of someone who believed themselves to be making a threat while maintaining plausible civility. Dorian stood completely still, listening, and his face was unreadable in the way stone is unreadable. He saw Emmeline on the stairs, and something in his posture changed, subtly, an almost imperceptible easing. Fenwick turned to follow Dorian's gaze and saw her. His eyes moved over her with the calculating sweep of a man looking for weakness. "Ah," he said. "The Duchess." "Lord Fenwick," Emmeline said, coming down the remaining stairs with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I did not know we were expecting you." "A social call," he said, with a smile that meant nothing friendly. "I wanted to offer my congratulations in person. The wedding was quite the occasion, though I must say several guests found themselves confused. The bride they saw did not quite match the descriptions they had been given of Miss Harriet Calloway." "Descriptions are rarely accurate," Emmeline said. "I find people always imagine someone differently than they truly are." A pause. Fenwick's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed," he said. "And where is Miss Harriet now? I understand she was unwell." "Recovering," Emmeline said. "Quietly, as one does." "How convenient." His tone was light, but the word was a stone thrown directly at glass. "A sudden illness the night before a wedding. I imagine that must have caused the family some distress." "Any illness causes distress," Emmeline said. "We were grateful the arrangements could proceed without interruption." She felt Dorian move to stand beside her then. Not in front of her, not in a way that removed her from the conversation, but beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and the message it sent was unmistakable. Fenwick looked between them. The calculation behind his eyes worked fast. "Of course," he said after a moment. How fortunate that there was a solution so readily available. His smile widened in a way that felt like a door being left open for a later entry. "I will not keep you. I simply wanted to see for myself how well the new Duchess has settled in." He gave a bow that was technically correct and entirely contemptuous. "Your Grace." "My lady." He left. The front door closed. Emmeline let out a breath so slowly it was almost silent. "You were extraordinary," Dorian said quietly, beside her. "I was terrified," she said. "I know. That made it more extraordinary." She turned to look at him. His expression was still composed, but something behind it had shifted, something she was beginning to recognize, the small, unguarded movement that happened when he was feeling something he had not planned for. "He will come back," she said. "Yes, but not the same way." He looked toward the door where Fenwick had exited. "He came today to read you, to see whether you would break under direct pressure. You did not." A pause. "He will need a different strategy now. That does not sound comforting. It is not meant to be. I want you to understand what we are dealing with clearly." She appreciated that, the refusal to soften things falsely. "What does he actually want?" Dorian turned and walked toward the study, and she followed. He closed the door behind them, and this time sat behind the desk, which she had not seen him do before. He pulled a letter from the top drawer and held it out. She took it, read it. It was dated 3 months prior and addressed to Dorian. The language was formal, but the content was unmistakable. Fenwick had wanted a business arrangement, a significant financial partnership, and Dorian had declined. The decline had been polite and absolute. "He took it personally," Emmeline said. "He takes everything personally. Men like Fenwick cannot separate business from ego." Dorian leaned back in his chair. The marriage gave him an opportunity. If he can destabilize it, create enough doubt about its legitimacy, he creates a problem that distracts me and weakens my standing with certain institutions that matter for the work I do. "What work do you do?" She realized she did not actually know. Beyond the title, beyond the house and the solicitor and the social weight of his name, she did not know what Dorian Ashvale actually spent his days on. He looked at her for a moment, as though deciding something. "Come with me tomorrow morning," he said. "I will show you." It was not the answer she expected. She nodded. That evening, Fletcher appeared in the library where Emmeline had retreated after dinner. He dropped into the chair across from her, with the complete lack of ceremony that seemed to be his defining characteristic, and said, "You handled Fenwick well today." "Your aunt coached me," Emmeline said. "Aunt Wycombe coaches everyone. It still takes something real to carry it off." He looked at her with open, uncomplicated curiosity. "Are you going to be all right here?" The question was so direct and so genuinely kind that it caught her off guard. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "That is fair." He stretched out his long legs and looked at the ceiling. "Dorian is not easy to know. I say that as someone who has known him his whole life. He is not cold the way people think. He is just careful. Things hurt him more than he shows, and he learned early to keep that very quiet." Emmeline was still. "Why are you telling me this?" Fletcher looked back at her. "Because you are going to be here, and because I think you are someone who would rather know the real thing than the comfortable version." He shrugged. "Also because he looked at you today, when you were on the stairs facing Fenwick. And he looked at you the way I haven't seen him look at anything in a very long time." She did not ask what way that was. She was not sure she was ready for the answer. Fletcher left shortly after, and Emmeline sat alone with the fire and the books, and the thought that would not leave her alone, no matter how many times she tried to set it aside. She was beginning to want to know Dorian Ashvale, not because she had to, not because survival required it, but because something real was pressing quietly against the inside of her chest, and it had started at an altar where a man had taken her shaking hand and said, "You are far more interesting," and it had not stopped since. She pressed her hand flat against the page of the open book in her lap. Outside, rain finally arrived, hitting the windows in long, straight lines. She did not move for a long time. The next morning, Dorian took her to the east side of the city. Not the London of grand houses and polished carriages and women in carefully arranged hats. The other London. The one that existed in the narrow streets behind the beautiful ones, where the buildings leaned toward each other like exhausted people, and children ran barefoot on wet cobblestones, and the air smelled of coal smoke, and something older and harder beneath it. Emmeline sat across from him in the carriage and watched the city change outside the window without saying anything. He watched her watching it. They stopped outside a building that had once been a warehouse. It had been converted into something else now, with clean windows and a painted sign above the door that read, "Ashvale Foundation for Working Families." She turned to look at him. "You fund this," she said. "I built it," he said, 4 years ago. "We provide apprenticeships, legal assistance, medical care for families who cannot afford it." He said it without decoration, the way he said most things. "There are 40 families currently supported. We are expanding to 60 by spring." She stepped out of the carriage and stood in front of the building for a moment. A woman came out of the door carrying a small child on her hip. She saw Dorian, and her whole face opened into genuine warmth. "Your Grace," she said, "we did not expect you today." "Mrs. Alderton," he said, and his voice did something Emmeline had not heard it do before. It softened. Not dramatically, but enough. "How is your husband's hand healing?" "Well, sir, the doctor you sent was very thorough." He nodded, and his eyes moved to the child, who was staring at him with round, solemn eyes. He reached into his coat pocket, produced a small wrapped sweet, and held it out. The child took it without hesitation, which told Emmeline this was not the first time. She stood beside him, and felt something move through her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It settled eventually into something that felt dangerously close to tenderness. Inside, he introduced her simply as Emmeline, without the title, without the formality, and she understood that was intentional. The people here knew him as a person first. The Duke was something he left at the door. She spoke to 3 women that morning, one whose husband had lost his position at the docks after an injury, one who was trying to secure a fair wage agreement for her daughter's work at a textile house, one who was very young, perhaps 19, sitting alone in a corner with the specific stillness of someone carrying something too heavy, and who looked up when Emmeline sat beside her, with the expression of someone who expected to be ignored. Emmeline did not ignore her. Her name was Petra. She had come to London from the countryside 6 months ago, following a promise of honest work that had turned out to be neither honest nor work in any acceptable sense. She had escaped it, but had nowhere to go, and no family to return to. Emmeline listened to all of it without interrupting. When Petra finished, she said, "You are safe here, and you will not be here alone." Petra looked at her for a long moment. Then her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together hard, and Emmeline reached out and held her hand the same way a man had once held hers at an altar, steady and certain, until the shaking stopped. On the carriage ride back, Emmeline was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Petra needs somewhere permanent to stay. The Foundation's current accommodation is temporary." Dorian looked at her. "Yes, Can we fix that?" A pause. Something in his expression shifted, moved, opened in a way that was almost visible. "We can," he said. And the word we landed between them, like something that had been placed there deliberately, by both of them, at the same moment. She looked out the window. Her reflection looked back at her, and she barely recognized the woman in it, not because she had changed in any dramatic external way, but because something internal had quietly rearranged itself. That evening, she was at the writing desk in the library, composing a letter to Miss Crane about Petra's situation when the door opened and Countess Wykeham came in without knocking, which Emmeline had already learned was simply how the Countess moved through the world. She sat across from Emmeline and looked at her with those sharp grey eyes that were so like Dorian's, and said, without preamble, "Fenwick met with your mother this afternoon." Emmeline's pen stopped. "My mother. At a tea house on Regent Street. My source is reliable." Wykeham folded her hands in her lap. "I do not know what was said, but your mother left the meeting looking shaken, and Fenwick left looking satisfied. The cold came back, fast and complete, like a window thrown open in winter. "He is going to use her," Emmeline said. "He is going to use what she knows," Wykeham corrected, "which is the full truth of how this marriage came to be. The genuine account, not the adjusted one. If he gets her to confirm it formally, he has grounds to challenge the marriage on the basis of fraudulent representation." Emmeline rose from the desk. "I need to speak to Dorian." "He already knows," Wykeham said. "He is in the study. He has been there since I told him an hour ago." A pause, and something in the Countess's voice shifted, lost its edges slightly. "He did not want to come to you with it before he had a solution. That is how he is. He tries to carry things alone first." Emmeline thought of Fletcher's words. Things hurt him more than he shows, and he learned early to keep that very quiet. She set down her pen and left the library. The study door was closed. She knocked once and opened it without waiting. Dorian was standing at the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in that posture she recognized now, the one that meant he was thinking very hard and feeling something he had not yet decided what to do with. He turned when he heard her. "You know," he said, "your aunt told me." She closed the door behind her. "What is the solution?" He was quiet for a moment. "There are two options. The first is to get ahead of Fenwick's account by making a public statement ourselves, through Sir Barnaby, that fully acknowledges the circumstances of the wedding, but frames it as a private family matter, handled with mutual consent, legally watertight. And the second?" He held her gaze. "Your mother. A beat. She needs to not confirm Fenwick's version," he said. "Whatever he offered her, whatever he said, she needs to choose the other direction." Emmeline heard what he wasn't saying. "You want me to go to her? I think you are the only person who can." She looked at him for a long moment. There was no pressure in his face. He was not commanding her. He was asking, and holding the asking carefully. The way you hold something you are not sure you have the right to hold. "My mother made her choice about me at the altar," Emmeline said quietly. "She dressed me in my sister's veil and sent me to marry a stranger to save herself from a debt she helped create." "I know," he said, "and you are asking me to go back to her." "I am asking nothing," he said. "I told you the situation. What you do with it is yours." She breathed, in and out, slow and deliberate. Then she said, "If I go, if I convince her, what happens to her? To my father? After all of this?" He looked at her steadily. "They will be looked after. The debts remain settled. I do not punish people for desperation, Emmeline. I understand it. She believed him. That was the thing she kept arriving at through every difficult turn of these few days. She kept arriving at the strange and solid fact that she believed him. I will go tomorrow morning, she said. He nodded. Then quietly he said, You do not have to protect me, you know. That is not your obligation. I am not protecting you, she said. And she meant it when she said it. I am protecting what we are building. The silence that followed was the longest they had shared, and in it, something passed between them that was neither friendship nor duty, nor the careful measured exchanges of two strangers learning each other's edges. It was something more than all of those things, pressing forward through every careful wall, and neither of them named it. But both of them felt it, completely and without question. He crossed the room. He stood close enough that she could see the rain grey of his eyes, and in them something unguarded and real and terribly honest. He lifted his hand and touched her face. Just once, his thumb at the curve of her cheekbone, brief and light as a breath. Emmeline, he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something he had been saving. She could not speak, so she simply stood there and let herself be seen, fully, for the very first time in her life. And it was the most frightening and most wonderful thing she had ever felt. Emmeline arrived at her family's townhouse the following morning, before anyone was fully prepared for the day. The housemaid who opened the door blinked at her, and Emmeline walked in without waiting to be announced. She found her mother in the breakfast room, alone, still in her morning robe, and her mother looked up with an expression that moved through several stages very quickly. Relief, guilt, calculation, and somewhere underneath all three, something that looked painfully like love, the kind that has been buried under years of difficult choices and does not know how to surface cleanly anymore. Emmeline, she said. Mother. Emmeline sat down across from her. No embrace. No preamble. Tell me what Fenwick said to you. Her mother's hands moved to her teacup and held it. He came to me as a concerned party. He said the marriage was under question, that there were legal complications. And he offered you something in exchange for confirming his version of events. A long silence. He offered to settle the remaining secondary debt, her mother said quietly. The one your father has not told anyone about. Emmeline closed her eyes briefly. There was another debt. Of course there was. How much? Her mother told her. It was significant. Enough that Emmeline understood, with a cold and complete clarity, exactly why her mother had looked shaken leaving that meeting. She was caught between two pressures and had no good exit from either. If you confirm Fenwick's account, Emmeline said, you destroy my marriage and hand him exactly the weapon he needs to damage a man who has done nothing wrong. A man who, since the morning I arrived in his home, frightened and alone, has treated me with more genuine decency than almost anyone I can name. Her mother looked up. And whatever you think of how I came to be his wife, Emmeline continued, I am his wife, and I am asking you, not as a daughter following orders, but as a woman making her own choice, to not do this. The silence stretched long and thin between them. He will ruin us if I refuse him, her mother said. Dorian will settle the second debt, Emmeline said. I have already spoken to Sir Barnaby this morning. She had. On the way here, the carriage had stopped, and she had stepped out, and had 3 minutes on a cold pavement with the solicitor, who had given her a look of genuine respect before nodding. The amount will be handled. Fenwick will have nothing to offer you that you do not already have." Her mother stared at her, really stared, the way she had not in years, perhaps ever, as though she were seeing her younger daughter for the first time as something other than the quiet one, the leftover one, the one who read too much and danced too little. "You arranged that yourself," her mother said. "Yes." "Without asking him first?" Emmeline paused. "He told me he does not punish people for desperation. I trusted that he meant it." Her mother was quiet for a very long time. Then she set down her teacup and pressed both hands flat on the table and said, in a voice stripped of its usual composure, "I am sorry, Emmeline, for the veil, for the church, for all of it. I was frightened, and I made you carry it." Emmeline felt the words land in a place that had been bruised since the morning she had stood in Harriet's empty room. She did not rush to forgive or dismiss or minimize. She simply let the apology exist in the room between them, real and necessary. "I know," she said finally. "And I am all right." She paused. "I am more than all right." Her mother searched her face and seemed to find something there that settled her. "He is good to you? Truly?" "Truly," Emmeline said. When she left the townhouse an hour later, her mother had written and signed a formal statement for Sir Barnaby, confirming that the wedding had proceeded with the full knowledge and consent of all family members. It would reach the solicitor before noon. Fenwick would have nothing. She sat back in the carriage and let the tension of the last several days leave her body slowly, like water finding its level. She watched the city pass outside the window and thought about Petra, who now had a confirmed permanent arrangement at the foundation. About Fletcher, who had appeared at breakfast that morning with a terrible joke that had made her laugh genuinely for the first time in days. About Countess Wykeham, who had looked at her across the table with those sharp grey eyes and said, without fanfare, "You are doing well," which from her was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She thought about Dorian. She thought about his hand on her face in the firelight. When the carriage returned to Ashvale House, he was on the front steps, which was unusual. Dorian Ashvale did not wait on steps for people. He was a man who existed inside rooms, composed and contained, and always slightly ahead of whatever was happening around him. But he was on the steps. He came down them when the carriage stopped and opened the door himself before the footman could reach it, which she was certain had never happened in the history of this household. She stepped out and looked at him. "It is done," she said. "My mother signed the statement. Sir Barnaby has it." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she was learning to read now. That quiet, unguarded shifting. The thing he could not keep still when he felt it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes." She paused. She apologized. His expression softened in a way she had never seen it do in front of anyone else. "Good," he said quietly. They stood there on the front steps of Ashvale House, while the carriage moved away and the morning settled around them. Then she said, because she was done waiting and done being careful with things that deserved to be said plainly, "I did not go there only for the marriage, Dorian, or for the legal situation, or for Sir Barnaby's documentation." He went very still. "I went because you looked at me in the study last night like I was something worth protecting," she said, "and I wanted to be worth it." He took one step toward her, then another, and then he was close, the way he had been in the church on the morning this all began, close enough that the whole world reduced itself to this one small, significant distance between them. "You have been worth it," he said, "since you walked up that aisle with your hands shaking and your chin up. trying to be brave in a situation that did not deserve your bravery. She felt tears press at the back of her eyes and refused to let them fall. That is possibly the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I intend to do considerably better, he said. And then he smiled, fully, genuinely, the smile that she suspected very few people had ever actually seen, and it was devastating in the best possible way. She laughed, and he heard it, really heard it, and the smile deepened. He took her hand, not the way he had, at the altar, steady and reassuring. This time it was deliberate, chosen, his fingers wrapping around hers with the clear and unhurried intention of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it completely. "Come inside," he said. "Fletcher has apparently attempted to cook something, which means the kitchen staff are in crisis, and we are needed." She laughed again and let him lead her up the steps and through the front door of a house that had felt enormous and cold and full of other people's flowers on the first night she arrived. It did not feel that way now. It felt like something was beginning. Not the careful, provisional beginning he had offered her in the study on their first night, when they were still strangers measuring the distance between them. Something fuller. Something that had grown in the spaces between hard conversations and quiet libraries and rain-heavy windows, and a man who built foundations for families nobody else thought to look after. Something real. Inside, there was indeed a minor catastrophe in the kitchen. Fletcher had somehow managed to involve 3 footmen, a housemaid, and Miss Crane in an attempt to produce breakfast that had resulted in smoke, laughter, and a quantity of burned toast that defied reasonable explanation. Countess Wykeham stood at the edge of the kitchen door, watching the chaos with an expression of profound resignation. She looked at Emmeline when she arrived. "You went to your mother," she said. "I did." "And? It is handled?" Wykeham studied her for a moment. Then she looked at Dorian, who was still holding Emmeline's hand, which was not a small thing in this household, in this world, where nothing was done without intention. Something in the Countess's sharp face settled, released, like a door finally allowed to close. "Well then," she said, and turned back to the kitchen disaster with her embroidery composure fully restored. "Someone remove Fletcher from the vicinity of the stove before he burns the entire east wing down." Emmeline looked up at Dorian. He looked down at her, and in the middle of the smoke and the laughter and the burned toast and the chaos of a house that was slowly, unmistakably becoming a home, something quiet and permanent passed between them, the kind that does not need words because it has already moved past words into something deeper and more certain. She had walked into a church in her sister's veil, terrified and alone, carrying a deception she had not chosen and a future she could not see. She had walked out, a duchess. But what she was now, standing in this kitchen doorway with his hand in hers, and the morning light coming through the tall windows, was something the title could not contain. She was Emmeline, fully, finally, entirely herself, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. If this story moved you, tell us which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the altar, the library, or the steps this morning? Drop it in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. And if you have been here from the beginning, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. There is so much more coming, and you do not want to miss a single part.